It's the first time Ouattara has left Côte d'Ivoire since the political standoff began. The incumbent president, Laurent Gbagbo, imposed a no-fly zone. The UN is vowing to ignore the order and continue flights. Aid agencies report that 450,000 people have been displaced by conflict since last year's disputed elections. A debate over Islamic radicalization is dividing opinion in the US. Controversial hearing has been told US Muslims are not doing enough to fight terror. Opponents have condemned the debate as un-American. And it's taken 3 years, but thousands of tons of construction material is finally on its way to Gaza. Those reports when we come back.
The army has to prove they have no intentions of hijacking power and of keeping any remnants of the old regime.
From people making the news.
The earthquake happened over a year ago. Now you want to come back and help your fellow Haitians?
To those it affects.
If Washington doesn't begin to help stabilize the government, it will create a backlash.
Behind the headlines.
Neither the United States nor China can hurt the other without hurting itself.
Is the inside story at this time on Al Jazeera.
To intervene or not to intervene.
A no-fly zone begins with an attack on Libya.
As NATO draws contingency plans,
including potential military options,
and Europe seeks UN authorization,
the current UN mandate does not authorize the use of armed forces.
We ask, is a no-fly zone just the beginning?
Once again, we are being tested.
And how will military interference affect Libya and the revolution beyond? Empire, at this time on Al Jazeera.
Welcome back. You're watching Al Jazeera. Let's recap our top stories now. The son of Libya's leader has warned rebel fighters the time has come for a full-scale military assault. When foreign ministers from Arab Gulf states have joined mounting international pressure against the Libyan regime. They say Gaddafi's government has lost its legitimacy. NATO and the EU have agreed to send warships closer to the Libyan coast, while French President Nicolas Sarkozy has recognized the opposition National Council as the rightful government in Libya. Saudi police have opened fire during a protest in the eastern city of Qatif. People were rallying for political change and the release of 9 political prisoners. Well, returning to Libya now, Al Jazeera's Huda Abdul Hamid is in Benghazi, the seat of the opposition rebellion. She's been gauging reaction to the latest developments.
Lots of disappointment here that so far the international community has not been able to impose a no-fly zone over the country. This is something the rebels have been asking for over and over again since the beginning of this uprising. Meanwhile, on the military front, it's quite clear that the much-feared counteroffensive by Gaddafi forces has started. Bras Lanouf today came under heavy bombardment, whether it's from the air, some rebels say from the sea. Certainly artillery shelling was used. There was also air bombardment in Brega. That's about 200 kilometers west of Benghazi, another oil-rich city, another oil terminal is there. And it's certainly the last stop for the Gaddafi loyalists before reaching Benghazi. Tensions have risen again in the city. You get a feeling that really the atmosphere has gone back to last week when the Gaddafi loyalists were in Brega, and at that time it seemed that the rebels were able to push them westwards towards Sirte. Now a week later it seems that the wave is coming in the opposite direction, certainly raising a lot of questions about what will happen over the next few days.
Amidst uncertainty in the Middle East, US stocks have plunged nearly 230 points. That's a fall of about 2%. Let's get more on this now and head back to Daljit in Washington. Daljit.
That's right, Sammy. The U.S. markets were jittery all day initially after concerns about trade in China and the Spanish government's debt. Those worries intensified after reports that Saudi police fired on protesters. Now, when the markets closed, that was about a couple of hours ago, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had fallen below the 12,000 mark. It is the biggest drop in a single day since August. Well, joining me now is economist Max Fradd-Wolf, and he joins us from New York. Mr. Wolf, what do you think's behind this? Is it oil jitters or is it something else?
I think it's a lot of things. I think there's been a growing concern that the markets are a bit overbought. We're only one day beyond the 2-year anniversary of the low from 2 years ago. The markets have gone up fairly steadily and a little beyond what they usually do without a correction. So that's kind of the backdrop. And then when you get Moody's downgrading Spanish debt, you get the Chinese trade surplus reported as a large trade deficit, even though we did see that in March of last year. And the wisdom is this has as much to do with Lunar New Year as it does to do with anything in the Chinese economy in the big picture. But you have that, you have increasing trouble out of Libya, you have the stories coming out of Saudi Arabia, and I think you have a growing awareness that the Middle East is shifting.
What about that very specific point about the shootings in Saudi Arabia? Are the markets really that fragile?
I think the markets are pretty fragile. I think a lot of people thought that this oil price rise we've seen over the last few weeks would be kind of a passing phenomena as the unrest in the Middle East eventually blew over or new governments came that didn't drastically alter the landscape, and that the core oil producing nations might be spared from the worst of the unrest. And getting stories of continued and escalating problems in Libya, as well as a shooting in Saudi Arabia, the heart of the oil industry, when we all know that Russia is producing all out, that we're already relying on Saudi Arabia to make up some of the lost production from Libya, and now you have the specter of real unrest in Saudi Arabia,
and
particularly
if that
before
unrest
Friday.
Spreads then to Saudi Arabia, will it set off panic in the markets?
If there's significant unrest in Saudi Arabia, you're going to look at $200 plus Brent and near or over $200 West Texas Intermediate within a few days if it's sustained and massive. So, I mean, I think the oil price rise we've seen so far will pale in comparison if we end up having anything like in Saudi Arabia what we're seeing in Egypt or Tunisia or Libya or even Oman.
And what is, just very briefly, the difference for investors? How does Saudi compare to Libya when we're talking about oil?
Well, I mean, the Saudis are producing more than 5 times as much oil. And the real importance of Saudi Arabia is they're the swing producer. There isn't very much excess capacity in the world right now for oil production. Russians are full out. Most everyone's producing full out. So any spare capacity, any ability to absorb increased demands or shock to the system, more or less comes out of Saudi Arabia. So if our shock absorber, our system for coping, Saudi Arabia, becomes actually a shock producer or unsettles the global markets, then the sort of place you look to for reassurance and hope of offset becomes the problem. And you're also looking at the largest proven reserves on Earth and the swing producer and the sort of place you go to in trouble, itself in trouble. Then you're looking at a whole nother order of dislocation macroeconomically and a whole nother order of oil prices and gas prices at the pump.
All right, Max Fradd-Wolf, thank you for joining us there from New York. Now, civil liberties groups and prominent Muslim Americans have raised accusations of religious intolerance after a prominent Republican congressman held hearings on what he says is the radicalization of young Muslims. And Congressman Peter King says it won't be the last hearing on the subject. Kimberly Halkett has more.
You can love here, you can hate here. People in the Muslim community.